You want to make work suck less? Get a good night's sleep. Poor sleep affects productivity, relationships, attention to detail, decision making. It also leads to long-term health issues like diabetes, dementia, and cardiovascular disease. Thankfully, today's guest on the DesuckifyWork Podcast is here to help. Zander Keig is a licensed clinical social worker who leads organizational well-being workshops for corporations. If you want to sleep better, he suggests reducing blue light exposure, creating a consistent sleep schedule, prioritizing 7 to 9 hours nightly, and backing off the caffeine. Fighting words, I know. Zander and I went deep on a number of desuckifying topics during the show, creating more natural, harmonious workspaces, moving to a 32-hour work week, navigating political and social polarization, and taking a more pro-human approach to diversity and inclusion. As a trans man, Zander brings a unique and often unexpected POV to these topics and more. It was a delightful conversation. I hope you enjoy. If you do, please like, share, rate, review, or subscribe. And feel free to share your thoughts with me directly as well. Okay, Zander Keig, welcome to the DesuckifyWork Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Well, it's an honor to have you here. I'm excited to dig into lots of good stuff. Before we do, I just want to give you a chance to kind of introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you do and how you came to be doing it.
Sure. Well, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I live in the state of Florida. I have only been here for about 6 years. I actually was born and raised in California, so I spent most of my life out there. I'm technically a California licensed clinical social worker, but I don't work with people in California for the most part. So I spent my career as a social worker in the federal government after a career in military and law enforcement. And so I'm fairly young, but I am retired from federal service. And I was thinking about what I wanted to do after retirement, and something really amazing just landed at my doorstep. And, typically, we might say to somebody, you can't just wait for things to fall in your lap. You have to actually go out and get them.
Yeah.
Well, I was doing consulting work with clinicians who wanted to talk through their cases with me. And one of them said to me one day, about maybe 7 or 8 months into the COVID lockdowns, I got this really cool gig doing psychoeducation workshops or webinars. So that's like teaching skills for how to regulate your emotions, tolerate distress, manage conflict, these kinds of things. And she said, I got this great job teaching those skills on via Zoom to employees and corporations all around the country and the world, because a lot of these are multinational corporations. And I said, that is my dream job. Can you hook me up? Wow. And a month later, I was working. So for, about 4 years now, that's what I've been doing, is leading these psychoeducation, or what we now call organizational well-being workshops.
Nice.
It's an extension of the EAP services and the mental health benefits through healthcare that people might have. It's like on top of that. So it's wonderful work. I love it.
That's a really cool story. I mean, I wonder, sometimes I wonder if something we did just by working hard and showing up sort of set the table for that to quote unquote fall in your lap.
Of course.
But that's a wonderful moment when that happens. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, of course, I was licensed for multiple years. As a social worker working in medical settings, most of the work that I did was psychoeducation based. I was working with homeless individuals, people with addictions. So I was teaching them these skills, right? These life skills. And so I already had that experience. I had been leading workshops and trainings since I was in my 20s. I had been doing public speaking since I was 10. My father got me into that when I was 10 years old. So, of course, I did have that skill set. And it probably didn't hurt that I was the Social Worker of the Year in 2020 for the National Association for Social Workers. And so I would imagine some employers might find that an added benefit to be able to say, oh, we we just brought on the social worker of the year. Nobody said that to me, but other people have said to me, I would imagine that might have had something to do with it. And I'm like, well, whatever.
It certainly can't hurt, right? I mean, at the very
So
least.
yeah, it didn't just come out of nowhere, but it feels that way, right? It feels
Yeah.
that way when somebody goes, oh, by the way, and I go, hook me up, and then I'm doing it. It feels like there was no effort at all. But
Mm,
of course, what people aren't seeing is all the under the water paddling like the
yeah.
duck,
Yeah.
which is all the work that I did up to that point. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to minimize it, but it sure felt effortless at the time.
Yeah. I do think sometimes, things do come together in a way that can feel like, wow, like that. But yeah, there's certainly always the backstory to it as well.
Yes.
You mentioned that it was your dream job. I mean, did you kind of have in your head that you wanted to be doing that? Or was it like, as soon as this person describes it, you were like, oh, that's perfect.
It was the perfect combination.
Mm.
So I really enjoy public speaking.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoy leading trainings and facilitating groups
Mm-hmm.
and workshops, right? Where people are learning things and I'm teaching them things and then they're practicing them and I'm walking around and,
Mm-hmm.
helping them with that. And then just the psychoeducation piece. I mean, for a really short period, I was a psychotherapist. It was on top of my regular job when I worked for the federal government. I had a
Mm-hmm.
side hustle, basically a private practice. I saw 7 clients for about 2 years. And one of the things that I noticed is that the majority of the reasons for why they were so much in distress was because, one, they didn't have good sleep habits.
Mm.
2, they had very low tolerance for distress in their lives.
Mm.
3, they were either conflict adverse or perhaps overly combative and aggressive
Mm-hmm.
when people did or said something that they didn't like, or vice versa, didn't do or didn't say something that they wanted them to. They didn't
Mm-hmm.
know how to deal with the rush of emotions that come when you're dealing with something that is contrary to you, what we might call dissonance. They're experiencing
Mm.
this dissonance where, right, in music, right, the dissonance, right,
Yeah.
there's a sense in which it's like irritating to the ears. Well,
Mm-hmm.
dissonance, emotional dissonance, can be very upsetting to our equilibrium, to our nervous system. And
Yeah.
if we don't know how to take a step back, but we have to train ourselves to take a step back, because we can't just expect that we're going to know to take a step back when we're
Mm-hmm.
in the midst of the stress or the
Yeah.
chaos or the danger, because our limbic brain, right, the part of our brain that says fight or flee or freeze or fawn, which is the other F in stress
Mm.
response, which is to get people to laugh and
Mm.
to, right, so you'll see a lot of kids who like to entertain the family as a way to keep the peace.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the fawn response to
Mm.
stress. And so
Interesting.
most
Okay.
people are just we're very instinctual, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
mammals, we run
Yeah.
on instinct, but through mindfulness practice and through skill building, taking tools and strategies and working them in the least stressful moments and building from that, we can develop the skills to step back and go, okay, I'm not going to react to this situation. I'm going to step back. I'm going to look at it. I'm going to process it. I'm going to figure out what I think about it. Maybe I'll write it down. Maybe I'll talk to
Mm.
somebody else. And I'm going to determine how I want to respond to it,
Mm.
right? Rather than react to it.
Yeah. I mean, I love that word dissonance.
Mm.
Because I immediately can relate to it. I know when I've been in that, I mean, and in some ways it's the music reference is great because it doesn't just feel like you just heard that note and then it went away. It's like that note is just on and you just are fighting to come back to equilibrium, which I imagine then triggers any one of those 4 responses that you talked about. And then the behavior that follows in that, particularly if you're in a workplace and you're trying to get along with other people and you're ready to fight or you're just running away or, whatever your response may be. So I think that's a wonderful descriptor that it's easy to grab onto and then go, okay, now you're telling me I can train myself to kind of remove myself so the note isn't as grating, and then go, okay, now what?
Yeah, because oftentimes if we think about, when is dissonance, in music used? Well, it's used in horror movies,
Yeah.
right? Where it's like all of a sudden your brain is alert to something's going to go down,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
like why are you running into the house? Shouldn't be running away from the house. Like we get really
Can't you hear that
activated by
music?
that, right?
Yeah.
Our heart might start to
Yeah.
palpitate.
Mm-hmm.
We might start to feel uncomfortable in our bodies, like we want to
Yeah.
get up and move, even though it's on a screen. So it's the same kind of thing. It's like these triggers, and we don't want to not have our brain respond to danger, right? We
Mm-hmm.
just need to be able to differentiate between when we are in true danger and when we are just perceiving a danger because a signal is being received, and that signal is being sent because it's attached to some older,
Mm.
like a memory, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
You smell something, and that smell reminds you of
Mm.
that person or that time that you had a very unpleasant
Yeah.
experience. And so your brain goes, "Oh, I remember that smell. That was unpleasant. The what happened what happened when that smell hit us the first time
Mm.
was not good. So we better get ready to fight or flight or
Mm-hmm.
freeze, right? It and
Yeah.
so we have to be able to very quickly, right? Situational awareness comes into play. We have to be able to like scan, right? We actually in danger.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that it takes a split second,
Yeah.
to know that, but we have to be ready for it. Otherwise we're just on automatic pilot, which then what we do is we go back, maybe hours or days later, and we go, okay, we run that whole scenario through our brain again
Mm-hmm.
and say, well, this is what happened, this is how I reacted to it, how could I do it differently, right? And we do that all the time. I mean, in occupations you do that all the time,
Yeah.
right? If a doctor makes an error, they call a group together and they go through the whole thing. Okay, what did
Mm-hmm.
you do, then what did you do, then what did you do, and what that person do, what that person do,
Yeah.
right? Because you get better at it. And so I just found that I was working with people, I had a caseload, and I was working with people, and these were the primary issues in their life. They said they had other issues in their life, but when I focused on helping them get a good night's sleep and learn how to tolerate distress and mitigate conflict and these different things, all of a sudden, those big problems in their life, they didn't disappear.
Yeah.
They just were not causing them as much distress, which
Mm.
was leading them to dysfunction, right? They weren't able to do their work correctly. They weren't able to do their schoolwork correctly. They weren't able to be engaged in relationships,
Mm-hmm.
well, like their well-being was suffering
Yeah.
because of those basic things. But sleep is the primary. I'd say once I got everybody focused on sleep, a lot of the issues started to subside.
Mm. I definitely want to dig into the sleep thing more because I think I imagine anyone listening right now is probably nodding their head that sleep is an issue in their life because it's so present. I want to dig into a couple other things first, one of which, as you mentioned, some of these responses we have to that dissonance, I think about the cultures that we experience in the workplace and how they can almost reinforce certain types of responses, meaning some workplaces you go into and go, wow, it's really combative here. That seems to be the default. And so if you naturally respond that way the most when you're like, oh, this is my place, and suddenly you have this stew of just constant battle, where another place might be more like good on the surface, but passive aggressive simmering underneath because people are fleeing from the dissonance and then finding a way to cope with it. And there may even be places that, are constantly sort of in a sarcastic, wisecracking kind of a mindset, as a way of coping with the distress that they're in instead of dealing with the issues. So I see how this can be reinforced really easily in an organizational setting. Have you noticed that as you've talked to some people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think the COVID lockdowns revealed a lot
Mm-hmm.
about workplace culture
Yeah.
and about coping mechanisms and about the well, in some cases, the complete lack of healthy, environments that people were working in, because all of a sudden they were at home and maybe their bully, right? A toxic person in their department or on their team, they didn't have to be around them all the time anymore. And they weren't having to feel like they were walking around on eggshells, or, maybe they were so distracted all the time at work because of all the noises and smells and lights and action that's going on around us. Now they're at home, and maybe they didn't have kids and people, running around, and they were like, oh gosh, I can focus better now. It's maybe I thought I had ADHD, but maybe it's just my work environment.
Yeah.
And so I think that helped a lot of people to understand, but that's also what prompted many of the companies like the one I work for to chop up as an employee benefit, right? Mental health employee benefit companies popped up, like Lyra Health, Modern Health, Spring Health. There's one called Better Up, which is a coaching benefit plan. It's not Better Health. That's a different thing, but Better Up.
Yeah, I know.
And so these organizations were able to fill this gap to provide the employers with this benefit for their employees, because there was so much uncertainty, and people were out of their norm, right? And so people were, in some cases, people were quite lost and struggling, and they needed something to help the employees to stay, focused.
Yeah.
And attentive, to whatever projects or programs or services or that they were, working on, products. So and they had to do that from everybody decentralized. So it shined a light on some of the dysfunctions in the workplace, because there's so many different issues in the workplace. One, you're spending a lot of time there typically. Right? If we think about going back to the day of everybody in the office, which seems like that's going to be the norm pretty soon, for a lot of people, since the federal government's the largest employer in the country.
Yeah.
And so you're back in the office, you're spending a lot of time there. Oftentimes people say things like, oh, your work, it's like your work family, right? They try and make this connection to you've got your family, and your work family. And it's like, oh no, you should definitely not. Professional, peers, and your family, right? I'm not a big fan of thinking of your workplace and your people you work with as like a family.
Yeah.
Because we don't treat our family members very well sometimes, right?
Yeah. Well,
very unprofessional.
That's a great point. It's interesting because I've seen it discussed both ways. Like, people will say, well, you don't fire your family members, which is actually not true, because people absolutely, create, complete and total distance from family members. So I do think that happens, but you're bringing it from the other perspective. Like, yeah, family for some folks may be a nice metaphor and it feels warm and right, but for a very significant amount of people, it has its own kind of dysfunction. And why don't we try to create something from the ground up at work that relates to the actual experience we're having and the way we want to relate to each other. I'm very curious.
And we might, just really quickly, let our family get away with a lot more than we should. Right. So there's that other piece of it, right?
Yeah.
Where we wouldn't deal with the shenanigans of our subordinates or colleagues. Right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. You can certainly tolerate more in a family setting, or you often do, because it feels permanent in a way that work less and less does, I would say. You talked about COVID and that disruption, and there's, it just seems like we're in a disruption kind of avalanche in many ways in the world right now, because it's, since then it's just been social and political turmoil, cultural turmoil, economic turmoil, like lots of stuff. And we have so much access to it through all of our media channels and that, so that we can feel overwhelmed. When you show up at workplaces or show up online and talk to folks through webinars, like what's sort of the temperature right now? Like, how are people feeling as it relates to work?
Well, when I do the webinars, for people who are familiar with the Zoom webinar format, I can't actually see the people.
Mm-hmm.
They can see me, but they do use chat. And so from chat, what I can tell is that people express a lot of appreciation and gratitude for learning or being reminded of skills that they can use to, how to focus their self-care, right? If you're a caregiver, what the stressors are of being a caregiver and how to manage those stressors. And these are just a few examples of the types of workshops that I do, how neurodiversity shows up in the workplace and how to navigate that and how to, how to request reasonable accommodations and what those might look like. Right. So they're very informative, very instructional, but very practical because we discuss the strategies and the tools, the application. And then in chat, I have people give examples. If you're putting together your values-based self-care plan, one of the ways that you can not guarantee, but perhaps boost the probability that you will follow through on it is that if you share it with somebody else and ask them to check in with you. So then I would ask a question: who are you going to share your values-based self-care plan with? Who is it? And so they put it in chat. And then I say, now on your handout, type that person's name on your handout. And for those of you who don't know, you have no idea, maybe you've just been given a clue by somebody else's example, right? So it's like, so I can tell from the engagement, and then I can also tell from the feedback. I give them a link and they do feedback. And so the feedback is not just that it's positive, the feedback that we get is, this was very helpful. Like, thank you so much. So I see that in the chat. I see that in the feedback. And it's been this way for the last 4 years. People really do appreciate. And because it's an employee benefit, they are actually doing it during work time. It's not on free time. They're allowed to go into these webinars during the work hours.
Couple things really interesting there. I mean, one, as you talk about some of that feedback, what I can hear probably in that is like almost just relief that this opportunity shows up, because certainly the world I come from is the world of advertising and marketing, and it's a stressful kind of high stakes kind of competitive business. And I hear just so much, like, clearly people are struggling, and to the extent that people get opportunities to manage that through any kind of programs, it's wonderful. I think we need a lot more of it in that space. I think it's underserved probably. But you see it on places like LinkedIn when people start talking about what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. You add sort of an unstable job market onto that, and there's this like fear that like the whole floor is just going to come out from under you at any point in time. So like, how do you navigate that? Talk about dissonance, like to just feel that your world may collapse can be a pretty sour note in your day to day. So that I think creates a lot of relief when you finally get a chance to be like, one, my company is providing this for me, and then two, to get to experience all the stuff you're talking about. And that leads me to my next question, because you mentioned this thing, values-based self-care. So now I'm curious, what does that really mean?
Yeah. Let me just briefly say something about another thing that we do when we're doing the workshops is we normalize things so that people go, oh, I'm not doing it wrong. There's nothing wrong with me. Right. This is just like how the brain works, or how I've adapted, or the coping mechanism that I, rely on. Right. And I can learn a new one, kind of thing. So I think that helps put people at ease that I'm not lecturing them like, okay, so you need to stop what you're doing because it's bad. and wrong.
Yeah.
And, you're an idiot for, like, it's like nothing like that. It's like,
Right.
no, like, and I include myself. I try and I personalize it as much as possible without disclosing too much about me personally.
Yeah.
That's just also a therapeutic, style that many of us have.
Mm-hmm.
So a values-based self-care plan. So oftentimes when we think about self-care, people generally think of self-care as, getting a massage or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, making all their own food, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Going to Whole Food,
Yeah.
Whole Food diet, something,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
or a mani pedi, or
Yep.
what I mean, a cold
Mhm.
plunge, something
Yeah.
like that.
Little
And
splurge
so
or
that,
something. Yeah.
yeah, something, which are great things. Those are good for like self-comfort, self-soothing, but
Mm-hmm.
self-care are things that we do that have long term, right? Those other things are short term.
Mm-hmm.
Self-care is doing things that have long-term benefit because we engage in them on a regular basis. They're reoccurring. And we make them reoccurring because we put them on our calendar as reoccurring with notifications. And we ask somebody to follow up with us to remind us, hey, did you do that thing you said you were going to do today or this week?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's helpful. So when we think about values, if we talk about like what is the most important thing to you in your life?
Mm-hmm.
Is it your education? Is it your family? Is it your faith? Is it your connection with nature? Like, what's your primary go-to for, importance? What really matters?
Yeah.
And if you can figure out what really matters, and it doesn't have to be just one thing because you
Yeah.
can have multiple values, and then from that you can create multiple activities that you do that are aligned with those,
Got
right?
it.
So if you
Okay.
say, well, the most important thing to me is to stay in touch with nature. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
that's somebody's primary value.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, so your primary value is nature. And you can think about like why that is, like, what is it? Why is it so important? Well, I
Yeah.
grew up, out on a farm and I spent so much time outdoors and with my family. And I just really love, nature and I love
Mm-hmm.
everything about it. I'm in awe and wonder and, amazement of nature. Right.
Yeah.
And so like I didn't grow up on a farm, so I'm not really talking about myself, although I
Sure.
am in awe and amazement and wonder of nature. I do
Yeah.
like nature quite a bit,
Yeah.
but it's like, okay, you identify the value and then you say, okay, like, so what am I going to do? Right? What
Mm-hmm.
am I going to do to demonstrate
Yeah.
that that's my value?
Mm-hmm.
Am I going to go on hikes? Am I going to learn to surf? Am I going to, you know, study biology, like
Mm-hmm.
marine biology, like, or geography, like archaeology, earth sciences? Like, what are we
Yeah.
going to do? Are you going to become a, pagan because they worship the earth? You know
Mm.
what I mean? Like, what are you going to do to
Yeah.
show up, to show up for that value? And then, right. And so it's like, well, are you going to show up like, what's the show up, like the energy of how you show up,
Mm.
right? Is it compassionately? Is it um consistently? Is it right? So like, how are
Mm.
you going to show up? And then
Yeah.
you put all those things together. And so when I say, if I were to say like, okay, so it's like nature, and I'm gonna be, very consistent with it, and I'm gonna go on hikes, in the hills,
Mm-hmm.
or jog on the beach, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And if there comes a time where I'm like, I just don't really want to do that. I don't want to jog. It's like, oh wait, I really love nature, and when I'm in nature, it
Sorry.
just makes me feel good, right?
Sorry
It
about
makes me feel good
that. Mm-hmm.
about life and about myself and about my health and about my body and about my life. So you take it off of I don't want to jog or I don't want to hike to I want to go out be in nature. So then you
Mm.
just change maybe what you were going to do in nature, but you still go and
Mm.
do something in
Yeah.
nature, right? You put the focus on the value, not on the activity
Mm.
necessarily, right?
Yeah. That feels like a couple of interesting things there. One, that last part, it's like it can create a mindset shift for you in terms of how you think about an activity when you're rooting it in something that really matters to you. The other thing is like, and I, as a coach, I know I work with people on their core values sometimes, and the question that comes up, and I've worked with people on this, is, and now what do I do with them? Right? Like, okay, I know I value nature, or I value connection to other humans, like whatever my value is. Okay. Yeah. Now what? How do I activate them? And that's what I hear here is like a way of activating them. And then that piece of like, how am I going to show up is a nice one, right? Because it contributes to the mindset shift. Like I'm gonna do it compassionately, consistently, whatever. Feels like a nice added layer to it.
There's one thing to think about when people, for people who have difficult time identifying what their values are. One of the things that they can do is think about what are called self-care fundamentals, right? So the self-care fundamentals are things like, how good are you at setting boundaries in your life? How good are you at paying attention to your nutrition and hydration? How good are you at staying in touch with other people, right? Socializing. How about, and sleep? Sleep is a self-care fundamental. So is exercise. And so are taking breaks, right? Not just a vacation or the weekend, but like, 5 to 10 minutes every 90 minutes, right? When you're in the workplace. So it's like, if there's a self-care fundamental that you feel like I could do a much better job on meeting my needs in that area, and then you identify what your value is, you can start putting those things together. So sleep is a self-care fundamental that I need to do a much better job at. And sleep is important because it regulates everything else in our lives, right? Our blood sugar levels, our mood, our appetite, our immune response, our weight. I mean, everything is regulated by the circadian rhythm, right? And so if that's dysregulated, everything gets dysregulated, and then we are more quick to be irritable. We aren't able to focus on projects, tasks, people. We're over consuming caffeine products, which then, I mean, it's like, so it's like, what is that thing that we need to can do a much better job at? Connect it with our value, and then connect it with the activity.
So I want to have a better quality sleep. I struggle with it. I have a value of, let's just say I have a value of connection with people. So then I think, oh, if I'm not as irritable, I'll connect better to people. This will provide me a way of bringing that value to life more easily. Then it somehow sort of rewires the brain a little bit to see it as a benefit to something that I really care about, as opposed to like I should get more sleep because that's what everyone says, but it's hard.
It's like, if you want to have a less conflictual relationship with people, it might be sleep. It could be other things too. It could be, taking in drugs or alcohol. It could be just, a temperament that is a little, grouchy. but you could, if people don't want to spend time with you, you can always ask them why. It's a difficult question to ask, but it's you're just not going to be as pleasant to be around if you're grumpy or snappy or irritable or frustrated or impatient.
I mean, the sleep thing is really interesting. I mean, I especially as you're doing this work with people in work organizations, like I imagine that might be a little bit like, we're talking about sleep and I'm at work, because I think for some reason we don't connect the two, even though obviously you can start to piece together the benefits. Have you seen people kind of respond in both a surprised and delighted way that comes into the conversation, and then realize that that's a powerful lever for them to experience work in a different way?
Yeah, most of the time when I experience is that people say, I had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they had no idea how much sleep regulates, right? How much
Yeah.
the circadian rhythm regulates all the systems in our body.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they're struggling with something, it's not likely. It's like, oh, I'm struggling with my weight. Most people don't think, oh, I should start getting a better night's sleep.
Mm-hmm.
It's they're like, oh, I need to change my diet. I need to exercise. I need to, that people don't go there.
Yeah.
There's a book called Why We Sleep by Dr. Matthew Walker. He heads up a sleep lab. I think it's UC Berkeley, University of California,
Okay.
Berkeley. And what he talks about, one of the things he talks about in that book is that sleep science is a fairly young science.
Mm.
Right? We have about 20 solid years, some maybe 30 if you kind of look at it in a
Mm-hmm.
broader way, but a good 20 years of solid sleep science. And he
Yeah.
said, before they started researching sleep, most people thought that you slept because you were tired. And he
Mm-hmm.
said, now we know that's like thinking that we eat because we're hungry.
Mm-hmm.
We eat because if we don't, we die.
Yeah.
And we have to sleep. If we don't sleep, we will lose our minds,
Yeah.
literally,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you think about it from a clinical perspective, when a person is experiencing psychosis, right, they're having hallucinations, um, they're hearing things, they're seeing things, they're experiencing things, they're having a manic episode.
Mm-hmm.
Sleep is the one sort of foundational issue there.
Mm.
Their sleep is so dysregulated because they are in a manic episode or paranoid, they have paranoia, like something is keeping them awake.
Mm-hmm.
And so the body is just running on adrenaline.
Yeah.
And eventually the brain says, oh no,
Mm.
I got to shut this thing down.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, you're completely out of your mind.
Yeah.
You're having a psychotic break.
Wow.
And one of the first things that happens when individuals like that get brought into into a psychiatric setting is they're given either a pill or injections, typically because people are going to be resistant to taking the pills. They
Yeah.
get an injection that knocks them out for 24, 48,
Mm-hmm.
72 hours. I mean, like,
Wow.
they're out. It's like restarting the computer,
Yeah.
right? It gives the brain a chance to restart
Mm-hmm.
because it's not functioning properly.
Yeah.
And so, and that's all related to sleep. You have to force them. Now, what's happening is the person is sedated.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not actually sleep, it's
Yeah.
sedation. So
Mm-hmm.
they're probably not going to dream or like
Dream.
have REM sleep when they're sedated,
Yeah.
but it's still the brain is still shut down in a
Mm-hmm.
way that gives it time to heal
Yeah.
from that utter chaos that it just experienced.
Yeah. I mean, as I hear all this, I mean, you can almost sort of, whoops, you can almost imagine that you're experiencing like a very micro version of that when you're somewhat sleep deprived, meaning like you're functioning, your mental functioning is off. Maybe not
Yeah.
full blown psychosis, but you are, and that's where the irritability and um, the behavior that we maybe wouldn't normally do starts to show up, the grumpiness, all that stuff. What I
It's like jet
wonder,
lag, right? When you're jet
yeah,
lagged, you're more likely to trip, you know, stub your toes, slam your fingers in the, you know what I mean? It's like
yeah,
we're more apt to make mistakes
yeah,
or, hurt ourselves because we're not able to pay attention at the same level as when we're, are awake. We've had sleep.
mm-hmm. So what are some of the things that you talk about as it relates to sleep to help people get into a more regulated pattern?
Oh boy. So there's a bunch of things, it's physiology, right? A lot of this.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, we are we're wired for a much older age and time, right? The way our bodies are wired up. So for example, before modern lighting, it was light in the daytime and dark in the nighttime. And we have a nerve, right? Optical nerve in our eye. And when light hits that nerve, it sends a signal to the brain to be alert. And it releases cortisol, which is, too much of that is not good. And also, well, we release it under stress, but it also is energizing and activating. But we don't want to be energized and activated at 10 p.m. But because there's so much light in our world now, we have bright lights in our home, we have blue lights on our electronic devices, which are emitting a light ray that's sending a signal to wake up, wake up, right? And so one of the things people can do is turn the blue lights off and turn on the red light, right? A lot of our handheld devices, you can shut off blue light, turn on the red light, or put an app or a screen or a filter. There's people get glasses that block out, the blue light. So that's one of the things to pay attention to, like maybe change out the light bulbs in the lamp that's like next to the chair or the couch that you might be watching something, your thing at night that you watch, and have it at that lower setting or just that lower bulb, so that you're giving because what ends up happening is, as the lights start to dim, right? The way our body is wired up is, as light starts to dim and it gets darker and darker, it's a signal to our body to start producing melatonin. And so oftentimes people think they need to take over-the-counter melatonin. But unless your body is somehow not producing enough for some medical reason, it might be that you're just exposing yourself to too much light, and so you're not producing your own levels that you need. So when we wake up in the morning, so I just explained, it's like biochemistry, right? When you wake up in the morning, your body starts releasing a chemical called adenosine. Adenosine builds up over the course of like 12 to 16 hours. That's our recycle rate. That's about as long as we have of good brain function. 12 to 16 hours, right? Without stimulants, just natural. And then it builds and builds and builds. And then the melatonin starts to dump in as it gets darker and darker. And the adenosine and the melatonin, those two chemicals produce sleepiness. Not tired, right? Not tired,
right?
Sleepy. And the difference is that your chin wants to fall to your chest and your eyelids want to droop. That's sleepy, right? Not that you've worked hard and you're tired and you wore out your muscles. No, that's not the same. You can be tired and go to bed and not be able to sleep.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So sleepiness is different. But what's interesting for people to know is that adenosine is released and then goes into a receptor in our body, right? Multiple receptors in our bodies. They fill up with the adenosine. But if you drink a bunch of caffeinated beverages, the caffeine blocks those receptors. And then the adenosine is just circulating throughout your bloodstream. And when the caffeine starts to wear off hours later, the adenosine just drops in there. And that's why we have that crash. Wow. Because it's too much all at once. It should be just naturally occurring. When I started teaching sleep seminars or webinars about 4 years ago, I cut out all caffeine for the most part. I mean, I'll still eat a little dark Dove chocolate, but I don't, and I never drank soda. Okay. I've never had any of those energy drinks. I've never had a Monster or Red Bull. I've never even tasted them. I don't know what they're like. I think I had a Joe Cola once in college, but it was awful.
Oh, yeah.
But I wasn't raised on soda. I don't drink it. And so, but I am an avid coffee drinker. So I just switched over to a high quality, decaffeinated coffee. It tastes delicious. I don't notice it. I never needed the caffeine. I'm very hyper, so
Yeah.
caffeine. But so when I just explain even just the biochemistry of it and how the optical nerve receives light and sends signals, and that produces chemicals,
Mm,
and those chemicals you don't want them in your stream all the time, like cortisol, and that those things you can dysregulate by having too much cortisol and not
yeah.
having enough melatonin and adenosine, and then you're going to perhaps develop insomnia,
Hmm.
and then that's a real problem.
Yeah.
Real problem.
Is there anything, we tend to rely on the stimulants, like as you mentioned, a lot of people grab the caffeine, coffee, soda, whatever. Is there anything from a dietary standpoint that that works with our natural rhythms, meaning things we should be eating more of in the morning, things we should be eating or drinking more of at night? Do you know of anything like that?
I don't know. I haven't ever looked into that. One of the
Mm,
things I can tell you is that when we get a good quality and quantity of sleep, right, at 7 to 9 hours per night, but we want it to be a good quality also. We don't
hmm
want to just be crashed out on NyQuil for eight
hmm
hours,
Right.
right? That's not a good quality of sleep. It's not
Yeah.
about only quantity, right? Alcohol impedes REM sleep, and
Hmm.
if you impede REM sleep, then you're not going to go into the deepest
Yeah.
phase or level of sleep, and it's not going to be as sound. And so if you have good quality and quantity of sleep, you will wake up feeling rested and you will have energy. I have heard, I am remembering it now. I have heard that it's good to have a high protein breakfast. That's what I've heard. It
Mm,
really, the brain feeds on protein. And it's funny to think about it. Like, remember watching the old shows like Leave It to Beaver, Wait Till Your Father Gets Home,
yeah.
Eight is Enough, these kinds of shows. And they were eating things like ham steaks and eggs
Yeah.
and, loads of butter. It's because but these people weren't fat, right?
Yeah.
People weren't overweight back then. It was a heavy, heavy protein breakfast
Mm-hmm.
because, well, you were going to be in school all day long, or you're
Hmm.
going to be at work all day long,
Yeah.
indoors or outdoors, and you need the protein, you need the brain fuel. And
Mm,
so I think there's,
yeah.
I don't know the science on it, but I've definitely heard people encourage that we don't have to have ham steaks, you
Yeah.
can, have a whey protein shake or something, but,
Yeah.
a high protein breakfast I heard does help, right?
Mm,
As far as getting
yeah.
the brain what it needs and wants. We need a whole lot of, I track my protein. I'm just curious about it,
Yeah.
in an app that I have. And I can tell you, I don't think there's been one day this year that I got the level of protein, the grams of protein I was supposed to have.
It's
It's
hard.
outrageous.
It's
It's something
hard.
like 160 grams for
Yeah.
my height and my weight and my
Yeah.
activity level, 160 grams a day. I'm
Yeah.
like, I'd have to be just eating steak all day long.
Yeah. I mean,
I mean, it's
I've seen
crazy.
those numbers. It's intense because, like, most of our meals at best have a bit of protein,
Yeah,
stuff, but there's also carbs and fats in there. And
yeah.
yeah, I would bet that
We need
most of
all
us
those things,
we're
but we
doing
need
like
mostly
half of the
protein.
protein probably
Yeah,
on a typical day, right?
yeah,
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I think there's
yeah.
just so much there. I mean, between sleep and how we eat in terms of what we put into our bodies that we just sort of do it on instinct, because it's what we know, whether it's because what we see on TV, what advertising has told us, what our
Yeah.
friends or family have done. And I think we have an outsized belief that we can sort of power through just about anything, particularly when you're young, you sort of develop that mindset. And
Yeah.
we resist this idea that there's a more delicate balance going on inside of us. And that
Yes.
takes sort of active participation in that, as opposed to like, no, I don't need any of that stuff. Just give me my coffee and I'm good to go.
Well, what's interesting is that when you hear people say, my father was one of these kind of people. He would
Yeah.
say, "I only need 4 hours of sleep. I'm fine." And my father was very fit. He was a marathon runner. He was in the gym every day, most of my life.
Hmm.
He was he did all the right things,
Yeah.
right? He was engaging with people. He did all the right things. And yet he developed dementia. Even though he did all the things that they say to do to not get it, he got it. And, one of the things about, there's something called sleep debt. And unlike financial debt, sleep debt can never be repaid or paid off. And so it compounds, it accumulates over the course of our lifetime. And so we might feel like, I don't need sleep, right? In our teens, we probably sleep for 12 hours. But as we get, I don't need much sleep. And people are like, older people don't need much sleep. And it's like, yes, they do. But for one reason or another, they're having difficulty getting it. But what the sleep science shows is that for people who have a lot of sleep debt, they're more likely to then have diabetes and dementia and cardiovascular disease and a whole lot of other things, right? Be more isolated. Like it goes beyond, correlarily being associated more causative, but it's, it's something to pay attention to.
Yeah. And it's
people would say, I'll sleep when I die. And it's like, well, I hope it doesn't come sooner.
Yeah. I mean, that's the crazy part. And the thing is, like, and I know this is true for myself. I mean, I try to pay attention to sleep, but I also know for whatever reason, there's so much internal resistance to it. Like I do things that are at odds with my belief that I know that sleep actually will help me. Like, I'll stretch my limits. I'll get up a little earlier to deal with some things, or I'll stay up later, or I'll eat things that I know I shouldn't be eating that late in the day, or, you do have more caffeine than you should, or whatever. And it's like the message, I think, has been out there more, but it's like somehow it's still not sinking in. Like, we're not fully connecting the dots to all the stuff you're talking about, that when we're not getting a good night's sleep consistently, it affects anything we care about. Whether we want to do better at work, we want to be better with our friends or family, whether we want to do better at certain sports where we care about, whether we want to, whatever. Yeah. It's connected to all of it. And yet we resist that. I don't know that there's an easy answer to help people not resist it, but I do appreciate that you're at least out there putting that front and center in a space where people might not be expecting to hear it so much, because people expect the wellness thing to probably be mostly about diet, exercise. Those are like the ones we're used to hearing. And both of those things are probably infinitely more useful levers when the sleep lever is dialed where it should be, I would imagine, Well,
even because, I work for a mental health benefit company, and people know that they're coming to a webinar that's being put on by a mental health benefits company, and that I'm a licensed clinical social worker. They might not understand how sleep plays a part in it. But then, we explain it. And, if you're not getting a good night's sleep on a regular basis, then it's going to impact your productivity in the workplace. It's going to impact your relationships with your colleagues and peers in the workplace. It's going to impact your, not just your productivity, but your, just your responsibilities and duties and tasks, right? Like your follow through, your attention to detail, right? All of those things are going to be impacted if you are groggy, or if you are hyped up on something that makes you feel like you can multitask. And when you multitask, you're just, you're doing everything slightly poorly, if not even worse. So it's like, it does seem like a strange topic of discussion in the workplace until you realize, oh no, like it really does matter, because it matters to the employer because it's about productivity and bottom line, but it should matter to the person, because the better you are at sleep now, the less likely you're going to be dealing with a whole lot of disease and illness as you get older. Like all get older. I mean, stuff happens. But the science is pretty solid on, how the lack of good quality sleep, just right, we're more accidents. And if we're more prone to accidents, whether we're driving or walking or engaging in sports, those injuries could have long-term impacts so that,
Absolutely.
we end up with a walker in our 60s instead of our 80s. Or,
Yeah.
what I mean? Like there's all these sort
Yeah.
of secondary and tertiary outcomes, that are related to the sleep.
Yeah. And the one thing that also showed up as you were talking about the productivity and the way you connect to work is like, one of the things that I sort of try to put out there is that, in its best case, work can be more than a job. It can be a place where you feel like connected to the work and you find meaning in the work and you connect to a sense of purpose. And I just have to imagine how much harder that is to do when you're sleep deprived. The neurons are not primed to bring that kind of emotional connection to your work when they're frayed by constant lack of sleep, I have to imagine.
Yeah, I would imagine people might be a little bit more pathetic and cynical. And there's also, I hear people say things like, when am I supposed to sleep? I've got all these responsibilities. And it's like, well, it's that adage that we hear every time we go on an airplane. You put on your oxygen mask before you put on somebody else's, right? Well, I'm a new parent, I'm on the baby cycle, sleep cycle. It's like, well, sleep training is really important for babies, right? So, try and figure out, what their cycle is, right? And maybe you could mirror it. Or some people are like, well, I have shift work, so I'm every 3 weeks my schedule's changing, and that's terrible. That's a really difficult thing, right? The body does not like that. Or they, it might be for some people the FOMO, right? The fear of missing out. They want to stay out late. They want to go out 4 nights a week. They want to because of that. Or they're strivers, so they're like, I want a promotion. I want to develop a product on my own time so that maybe I can launch a side hustle or start my own business. So you have to do that outside of work hours. So I get it. Those are all really reasonable, pushbacks.
Yeah.
And we're animals, and we have systems in our bodies like, circulatory and nervous and endocrine, and we also have a circadian, clock in our my brain, I guess. It's not literally a clock, but and if that clock gets out of whack, everything else gets out of whack. So it's like, you're not going to be able to keep that up for very long.
Yeah.
And the consequences down the road, they're not worth it to me. I guess if people want to make and say, yeah, I'll just deal with diabetes and dementia and, having to have, my hips replaced or, going into assisted living before, any of my relatives kind of thing. Like, being a social worker who's worked in those environments, and I took care of my father the last 5 years of his life. And I can tell you it's not very glamorous when you lose, when you become incontinent. And you lose your ability to recall people, and you can't bathe yourself or dress yourself anymore. I mean, we all end up in some way there, but it doesn't have to be sooner.
We don't have to accelerate it. Yeah. And I think, again, we're so good at just shutting that acknowledgement off and just kind of trying to like, that's some future thing. I don't need to worry about that. But
it's the short term, right? That drink tastes good. That cigarette feels good. Dancing into the wee hours with that person feels good. But I mean, maybe people are, hedonists, and they just are about, they're just pleasure seeking. But again, I think the time runs out on that.
I think so. And I think
it's like, okay, maybe get it out of your system in your 20s, but at a certain point, you have to,
you do. I think it's
hunker down a little.
Yeah, there's a mindset shift there that can be, I think, harder for some of us to accept sometimes. But I want to shift gears to a couple of other things before we we wrap up, one thing, I know that you are involved with the ProHuman Foundation. I think you were, or maybe still are, connected to the organization FAIR, which are groups that I've either been a part of or certainly have supported. What is your role with any of that right now? And I'm curious how that part of your life is engaging with sort of the current political climate that is very disrupted right now.
Yeah, I was brought on to the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, or FAIR, by its founder, Brian Bartning, probably about middle of the year 2021, the year it was founded. And I came on board originally as part of their advisory board. And then a few months into it, I was brought on as a contractor to work in the FAIR Diversity Program, which was the corporate training program that brought a pro-human lens to diversity trainings. And just simply an example of that is nobody was ever broken up into groups based on identity or affiliation or an immutable characteristic like race or ethnicity. So that, we were often brought in after a different kind of diversity training had taken place, and it created, it unraveled the departments or the agencies in some ways. I was privileged to work with Daryl Davis at FAIR, who is a magnificent, amazing person. I encourage everybody to look him up. He has TED Talks and he's all over the place. He's a brilliant man, does amazing work. And in 2023, I believe, maybe late 2023, Brian Bartning started the ProHuman Foundation. So he's no longer involved with FAIR. I am no longer involved with FAIR. FAIR's still doing, a lot of really good work. I've moved over to the ProHuman Foundation because it's more focused on the things that I want to focus on. And I'm still working with Daryl, right? Nice. Daryl is our ambassador, and he is heading up an ambassador training program that has a cohort of about 36 students. And I am on faculty in that ambassador program. And I'm also on the advisory board for the ProHuman Foundation. In addition, I'm a founding board member of the Institute for Liberal Values. And the Institute for Liberal Values is a kind of like I don't know, we collect other groups that want to be part of the institute. And so it's like a consortium of sorts where maybe not nonprofits or single individual projects that are aligned with liberal values, right? The classical Enlightenment ideals of liberal values. And so we're the fiscal sponsor for some of those entities. But the umbrella is the Institute for Liberal Values. And we, it's made up of a lot of different organizations like Free Black Thought and just a lot. It's too many. So amazing work. And as a social worker, I'm working with other social workers through a project called Pro Social Workers. And we're developing a continuing education platform to provide CE units for social workers that offer viewpoint diversity in addition to all the other types of diversity for people who need continuing educations for licensure. And we are part of the Institute for Liberal Values, part of that consortium. They're our fiscal sponsor.
The world of DEI has seen a lot of shakeup with the new administration, and there's also just sort of a shift. You're hearing about certain companies either abandoning or rethinking or redefining. The work you're doing with some of these groups, is that connecting to this shift and helping people maybe see what a better possibility might be for that world?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's like diversity is something to be celebrated, right? It's like if we don't have diversity, including diversity of thought, then we're going to fall into all kinds of traps. And, for example, groupthink, right? If everybody thinks like you, like a lot of times people will just kind of look around and say, oh, there's a lot of diversity in this room. There's a lot of diversity in this business, on this team. But just because people look differently doesn't mean that they think differently. And if they don't think differently, then how is that going to impact, services and
Right.
products and projects?
Yeah.
If you don't have somebody who goes, well, what about this or what about that, without being, kicked off the team or thrown out of the office or, excommunicated from the
Yeah.
church or the family, right? It's like that ability to bring in different ideas, right? That's what brainstorming is all about. It's about taking in all the ideas and then being like, well, well, that one doesn't really work. That one doesn't work. But what if we combine these three things? That might work, right? And some people will fight back and say, "Oh, so you're saying it's okay that people should be able to like bring their, anti-Semitism into the workplace?" And it's like, no,
Right.
like workplaces have policies, and there are legal, right? There are legal issues at play. You can't create a hostile work environment, right? So businesses know how to protect themselves.
Yeah.
And so this is just a way to say, we're going to come in and we're going to do a training that teaches people how to get along with each other better. It's going to teach people how to not react to their colleagues, but to listen, to be curious,
Yeah.
to ask for clarification, to maybe challenge, but not in a way that is disruptive or dismissive or dehumanizing, right? That's the pro-human emphasis is, when I talk about Daryl Davis and the magnificent work he does, it's a prime example, right? Daryl Davis is a Black man who has face-to-face conversations with members of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations. And he asks them a simple question, directly or indirectly: why do you hate me when you don't even know me? And then he lets them talk.
Yeah.
He doesn't argue with them. He doesn't push back. He doesn't name call them. He doesn't disrespect them. He listens. He treats them like a human being. He finds their views abhorrent.
Of course. Yeah.
But they're a human being,
Yeah.
right? Other people might say, we're all the children of God, whatever language people use. And so the idea is we go into the workplace and say, we're all people. We're all human beings. We have a shared humanity, but we all have different perspectives and upbringings, and opinions and ideas. And we might have a common goal, but we don't all agree on how to meet that goal. So let's find a way to work together. And so we talk about things like what's in group and out group bias, confirmation bias. We try to teach people, like, if you're automatically rejecting somebody, it might be for one of these reasons, right? We call them cognitive distortions clinically, right? Just biases. And so, most people are used to something like, oh, my company makes me do an implicit bias class.
Right.
And all that's teaching is that every single person has a brain, and every person's brain, unless there's a problem with it, right, sends a little signal of distress.
Yeah.
And so we're aware of it sometimes, we're not aware of it other times. But once we become aware of it, we can go, oh, why is my brain sending me that signal? Right? Like, is there a pattern to this? And what kind of experiences have I had in my lifetime that generates that? But it doesn't mean I need to scream and yell or name call somebody or try to get them, fired from their job or kicked off the committee, which is what's been happening the last several years.
Yeah.
It went too far. And then the result, right, the pendulum swung too far one way, and now it's going to swing in the opposite direction, and there will be fallout from that. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. To find homeostasis, sometimes you have to swing. And we do that with ourselves, with our body, with our relationships. It's all the same.
It feels like that, right? It feels like, if you pay any attention on social media, you can see at least some folks are clearly like swinging hard one way now in reaction to what they felt was too far the other way. And there's a lot of over correcting that feels like it's going on. And I think what I connected to most about what you said. I mean, this pro-human idea, I think, is really interesting because it starts from a unifying place, right? We're all human beings, and we have a lot of things in common, and we share a lot. And then it opens the door to, through that lens, what are some of the differences? And then this is that other piece, which is to be really curious about those differences and not try to flatten everyone into sort of one perspective. I mean, when I think about some of the programs that have been installed before, like even with the best of intentions, like, and even if you focus primarily on the sort of immutable traits, but then you tell people with any one of those traits, whether it's race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, etc., if they don't show up a certain way or in a certain expected way, you don't want to hear it. You're actually like sort of double devaluing that person, right? Because you're sort of saying, not only do I not want to hear you, but as a person who fits a certain category, I'm actually telling you there's a stereotypical way you should show up, and I'm judging you because you're not. So I think,
well, and with Daryl Davis, after somebody is like said all that they want to say, it's like, they're like, oh, wait a minute, like this guy listened to me.
Yeah,
like I feel heard. He didn't argue. He didn't get up and walk away. He didn't try to punch me. And then he just engages in conversation. He might share a story with them, like to slowly chip away at some of those, fairly hardened, ideas. And as a result of that, somewhere between 200 and 300 individuals have left the KKK.
Yeah.
They have actually given him their robes and hoods. He has a collection of them. That's and amazing. In some cases, they were like national leaders who, when they left, it shuttered multiple chapters of the Klan.
Wow.
Right? Like that's one person listening to one person. And supposedly that black man shouldn't be listening to that white supremacist.
Yeah.
And that white supremacist shouldn't be talking to that black man.
Right.
But I heard a story years ago. You might cut it out, but I'll tell you anyways right now. It was a Jewish guy. I believe he was a rabbi. And there was this guy that used to call him on a regular basis. I don't know what that means, daily, weekly. But he would call him on enough regular of a basis and just spew all kinds of hatred over the phone. Just gross stuff.
Wow.
And one day the rabbi realized he wasn't called. I hope he's okay. He called him. He called him to ask him, are you okay? I haven't heard from you.
That's amazing.
And the guy was like, oh my God. I think there was something wrong with him, like he was sick or something. The rabbi went to his house. He was local.
That is mind-blowing. I mean, beautiful, like, mind-blowing.
Right? That's to me, that's it. Like, I love things like that. I've had the honor of being able to do some of that kind of work on a much smaller scale, right? As a trans guy, I often meet people who are either, I don't know, anti-trans, that's what people will call them, or they just, they don't like it. They don't understand it. They're confused by it. They just want to say no. It violates their, whatever, their religious values. And I'm like, all right, like, I'm okay. Like, my worth isn't dependent on their acceptance and tolerance of me. I'm good. But I show them that I'm a human being, they're a human being, and I'm going to treat them as such. And as a result, I've actually been able to, nobody's going to march in the Pride Parade. I don't even do that anymore, right? But, because it's kind of a hostile environment in some cases, for somebody like me. But it's because I'm fairly moderate, right? But all of a sudden, it's like people who are like, oh, well, I had no idea. Like they had notions or ideas, and a lot of it comes from social media. I'm not on social media other than LinkedIn. I have LinkedIn and Substack. I've never had Twitter or Instagram or TikTok. I got rid of my Facebook over probably 15 years ago, a decade ago.
Mm.
As a federal government employee, it just wasn't wise to be
Got it.
on those things.
Mm.
And so I don't have the experience. So in the last 10 years, when things have really ramped up on social media with all of the just, yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I'm talking about. I wasn't exposed to any of that at
Mm.
all.
It's really interesting. There's two things there that I think are interesting. One is by not being on social media, you have a very different experience of the world. And yet, I don't get the sense that you feel like you've had a deprived experience
No,
of the world,
no,
and
no.
in many ways, maybe it's preserved your sanity because you haven't been so incessantly exposed to all sides of everything.
Yeah.
And,
No,
and
people are people. I understand what motivates people. I
sure.
understand, it's like I was a juvenile delinquent, you know. I spent a year and a half in a group home. I was actually in a psych hospital for a year when I was a teenager. I
Wow.
was out of control. But then I was in the military and I was in law enforcement. I went to college and grad school a few times. Like I understand people.
Yeah.
I get that, within each of us is the possibility of doing something good or doing something wrong. That we
Hmm.
have the potentiality for goodness and for evil. All
Yeah.
of us do. And
Hmm.
so it's but what do we want to pay attention to? So nothing about social media and its toxicity surprises me at all
Yeah.
because it's so anonymous and it's also so like hands off. It's 10-foot pole, right? So
Hmm.
people aren't in any danger if they
Yeah.
spew hatred because they're not going to get punched.
Yeah. 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 No,
So
I know.
it's
That's a,
they get away with more of that.
yeah. It allows
It's
us to bring out some of the uglier sides of ourselves
Yeah,
with very
yeah,
low consequence. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
It's similar to family. Why we might be uglier with family than
Right.
non-family is because family tends to let us back in,
Yeah.
forgive us.
Yeah. There's an
Um,
expectation that we're connected to that by blood.
yeah,
So therefore, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I'm really just curious, building off of that, some of that a little bit. Um, if you have kind of a take on the shift as it relates to being a trans man, like there's a lot of shifting happening there.
Yeah.
Is that affecting you personally, and is that showing up in how you're some of the work you're doing in terms of how you're trying to help
Mm.
organizations navigate that?
Well, not professionally, but on the
Yeah.
personal side, of course, I've I don't even know how you say it. I started the medical process of my transition, 20 years ago. So I've been sort of doing this for a while. So
Yeah.
I'm stable in who I am and my place in the world.
Yeah.
But I'm connected to a lot of people that are. This is very destabilizing for them,
Yeah.
right? These executive orders and yes, it is very destabilizing. And so oftentimes I have two different types of people that send me a lot of texts.
Mhm.
One is a set of people who will be like, let me make sense of this. Um, how are you feeling about this? How is this impacting you? Because all I'm seeing is, danger, danger, danger,
Mhm.
and it's setting off their limbic brain, and
Yeah.
so they're like, am I crazy? Like, is this real? What are you doing with it? And then there the other group of people who are sending it to me and saying things like, could you not be upset, and we're under attack,
Mhm.
and so it's and what I say to people is, listen, are these things going to impact me? Yeah, probably. I don't know in what way yet.
Yeah.
And I don't tend to get all worked up about things I don't know about.
Mm.
So I'm uncertain, but the possibility exists that when I go to renew my passport in a couple of years, it might come back to me with an F on it instead of an M, right? For
Mm.
female rather than
Yeah.
male. Currently, it has male.
Mhm.
The entire time I've had a passport, it has said male.
Mhm.
So I'm on my second one now, and I did all the proper things to get it back when I got it back in 2007.
Yeah.
And they said, well, what are you going to do? And I'm like, well, I'm sure there will be a process or a procedure or a policy, if not all of those things, that's going to answer that question for me. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it is yet.
Mm.
It could be something like there used to be a process by which if we lived in a state where the state wouldn't allow us to change our identity documentation, it wouldn't let us change like not our name, because you could change your name legally, but some states wouldn't let like a male change their name to a female name, vice
Okay.
versa.
Yeah.
And that right there, it gets me in trouble because I talk about male and female.
Right.
But I'm, I'm a medical social worker, and so I've worked in hospitals, and it's really important to know what sex somebody is when you're giving them medications
Right.
and looking at their blood lab,
Yeah.
results.
Mm-hmm.
And so we used to have this process called carry letter. And the carry letter was an official document on letterhead from your doctor that said, this is my patient. They're under my care. They're a transsexual. That was the language back then.
Yep.
They're in the process of, transitioning from female to male or male to female. And therefore, their appearance is going to be different from what appears on their identification card.
Mm.
And it was a way to say, here's my driver's license, and here's a letter from my doctor. Now, who knows what was going to happen, right? You could encounter a police officer who was not going to be fined,
Yeah.
or worse,
Mm-hmm.
or better, right? You just never knew.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it'd be because you only need a passport really when you're traveling. So you go to the airport, you go to TSA, and it's gonna get flagged, and they're gonna be like, this guy has an F on his passport, and
Mm-hmm.
I imagine I might get sidelined.
Yeah.
And then I have to, or maybe just there and then I show the letter and hold up the line. But they're going to have to figure something out, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe somebody like me is going to be like grandparented or grandfathered in, and
Mm. Yeah.
they're not going to look that far back. We have no idea. So as of
Yeah.
right now, there's executive orders, but so far there hasn't been any policy.
Policy actually implemented. Yeah.
Yeah, or the procedures, the processes, right?
Yeah.
That people. So I'm waiting. I'm sort of a wait and see, person, and I don't have any interest in getting all riled up and being afraid or angry and having all that adrenaline and cortisol coursing through my body because, well, it would disrupt my sleep.
Right.
And it would interfere with my, my exercise, schedule, because I wouldn't feel like it, because I'd be tired. And so I just focus it back on those things. I mean, I've done enough of this work, and I teach it constantly that I'm reinforcing it.
Yeah.
I also have been doing mindfulness meditation since I was 12. My dad got me into it. Wow. My dad was a really cool guy. So
I was going to say, you got mindfulness at 12, you got public speaking at 10. You had some good exposure early on.
Yeah. Well, when I was 9, he enrolled me in something called EST.
Oh, so, I remember that. Yeah.
He was a trainer with us. So I went through Kids EST for like 3 or 4 years. Okay. So yeah, okay. I mean, I have good skills and, strategies. I'm not, they don't always work.
Yeah, of course.
I'm a person, and I'm not a robot. But I do my darndest to keep myself above the fray.
It's a really interesting.
Not being on social media helps right now. I'm sure.
I can imagine, particularly in that space, but just in general, like it's a really good demonstration, I think, of how you talk about sort of how you regulate your emotional state and kind of figure out when the time is to have the cortisol come up, meaning, okay, maybe now there's a policy and a procedure that is going to be quite disruptive. And okay, I need a little something to figure that out, or maybe there's a way to fight that or whatever. And then I think
I'll just do it. Right.
Yeah.
Like if this is the rule,
right.
I follow rules. I mean, I will just do it. If we go back to carry letters, I will get a carry letter. And then, because because I started this 20 years ago, I started before we had all the things that people have now. So
Yeah.
I remember all of these.
Yeah.
It's like it was a bit more cumbersome and challenging,
Yeah.
20 years ago, 30, 40, 50. I know people that have been on testosterone. They're trans men like me. They're in their 80s. They've been on testosterone since their 30s. I mean, we're
Wow.
talking about,
Yeah.
decades and decades. So the level of disruption is unknown right now to
Yeah.
people's lives. Our ability to access medicine. Currently, there's nothing in any of the executive orders that um, jeopardizes or threatens access to, say, like cross-sex hormones or what people might call gender-affirming hormones
Yeah.
for adults. They've
Mhm.
already cut it off for children, or they're going to cut it off for children.
Yeah.
Now, the executive order around children, like if I had been there when they wrote that, I would have begged them not to use the word mutilation in the title
This
and
is the,
text of that. It's
yeah.
highly inflammatory. It's unnecessary.
Yeah. It's the
It comes from a
overcorrection.
very particular,
Right.
you know, online mostly community.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. I know what they mean, but I don't like it. A lot of people who detransition use that language,
Yeah.
talking about their own body, but then they go too far because then they refer to me and what I did as mutilation. And I'm like, no, you
Right.
don't get to do that.
No, I think that
You don't
that's
get to do that.
that feels like the challenge with so much of this is that we tend to retreat to sort of the comfort of the extreme belief that is very black and white for somebody, whether, like if somebody wants to use a word like mutilation, that somehow like gets reinforced in the culture. And it's like, it's either that or it's perfect and wonderful, as opposed to going, this is something that requires some nuance to talk about. What does it mean to go through a transition? What does it mean? How do you express that with language that can be both supportive of the human being, but also questioning, because I don't fully understand exactly what's going on there. You don't have to retreat to either you must accept all of my sort of political views on this topic, or you must just be a kind of a complete dick about it, to be blunt.
Yeah, no, that polarization.
Yeah.
I'm also involved in an organization called Braver Angels, and Braver Angels
I love that
is
group.
focused on dealing with this sexual polarization. And so I started an LGBT caucus in Braver Angels to, for the blues and the reds of us to come together. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, and I'm on a mental health forum with them, and we're trying to like talk about these issues among mental health providers. Yeah, it's and the language is very, I mean, it's telling. When they say chemical and surgical mutilation, right? They didn't say hormonal. They said chemical.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I inject testosterone cypionate into my body, it is a bioidentical right medicine or chemical. Right. It's not testosterone that my body produced, right? Because males and females both produce androgens and estrogens, right, at different levels.
Yeah.
And so my body doesn't make enough testosterone for me to grow a beard. So I inject exogenous testosterone into my body. And so they'll call it a chemical because it's not it was made in a lab versus versus things like
in some way
progesterone, I think, which is from estrogen that comes from the male horse urine, which is interesting. But so it's like that's probably considered natural, versus bioidentical, which is they've made the molecules up in the lab and then put them into some oil, whether it be sesame or cotton or something, cottonseed. So it's and so like I get it technically, but it was a calculated word choice.
Of course, and, it's a signaling word.
I'm disappointed by it, but I don't make the rules.
So, no, I get it.
Nobody asked me.
No, I know they don't ask most of us, unfortunately, and then just mostly do whatever gets them money from the most extreme wings of their parties. So I get that sort of.
But I get the concerns. I get the concerns.
Yeah.
That that led to
Yeah.
the executive order.
Yeah. I think,
And the fact that you couldn't talk about it at all pushed people to want to set the whole thing down, right?
yeah, I
So
do.
overcorrection, I
I
think.
think there was definitely a vacuum of space that could have been really used for good conversation around this topic, but it was
Yes.
not. And
Yes.
you have to swing one way or the other. I want to just quickly touch on one thing that you wrote a book called The Third Space, a nonconformist guide to the universe, which just sounds delightful to me. I haven't read it yet. But the biggest question I had out of that, because I've heard that term, but I don't really fully think I understand it. What is a third space as you speak to it, and what was kind of your hope with this book?
Yeah. So I'm not the originator of the concept.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that there's actually a whole bunch of books with third space as part of the title or the subject matter. So I was like, oh, that's cool. But for me, from a very young age, I would find myself in situations, circumstances, places where people would be divided up into two different categories, right? Boys and girls. And I was sort of like, I don't really want to go with the girls. I don't like girl things. I'd rather go with the boys, but I wasn't allowed to. And so I would, I would resist. As I got older, I would sort of stand my ground and I would say, I'm not going with either one of those. And so that would show up like maybe in my 20s and 30s if I would go to some like weekend workshop where they'd say, okay, the men are going to go off into this room and the women are going to stay in this room and you're going to have conversation just among yourselves, yada, yada, some sort of like actualization or human potential, kind of like newer versions of EST kind of thing. And I would say, I'm going to go stand in the corner and anybody who wants to join me, who doesn't feel like the all male space or the all female space fits them, we can create our own third space. And I was telling that story to the publisher and they said, that'd be a good name for a book, right? It's like, I'm not a contrarian. I'm not trying to be rebellious. I'm not a rabble rouser. Actually, I'm quite I was raised in a Mexican Catholic family. I was in the military. I was in law enforcement. I'm actually a rule follower. Like I wait until the walk sign says walk. I mean, I don't it's ridiculous. I mean, it's kind of pathetic, and I was never even a Boy Scout because I wasn't allowed to be. But I didn't want to be a Girl Scout either. So, because I didn't want to wear green skirts. But, and it was always campfire, boys or girls. I was like, come on, man, why can't we just all go together and camp? But right, so this idea of, I wasn't doing it because I was hiding something. I was just like, doesn't feel natural to me.
Yeah.
I don't, it's like, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm an independent. I'm registered as an independent. For most of my adult voting years, I was actually Green Party, so I was outside of the two-party system. And that's because I was in California and Florida, and there's a lot of environmental, factors around with the Green Party, and so. And it's just like, and here I am, I'm a trans man, and I'm quite heterodox, and I'm a moderate, and all trans people are supposedly supposed to be. Not even liberal, but progressive. And from what I can see, not everybody, but a lot of the progressives that I've known over the years have turned out to be quite regressive. I don't see much progress at all. They've become quite authoritarian. And I think that's what's happening is you have the authoritarian left and the authoritarian right that are battling things out. And now it's through executive orders and tweets. Or I don't even know what X calls them anymore. Whatever those things are that you do on
I
X.
don't know. Are they X's? I don't know.
I don't know. I call it twits, with a capital X. So I was always just like, you know what, I'm gonna be over here. Another example of this is I was a trainer for a couple of years with a national organization. I work with high school students, and it was all about sharing, your culture and, race, ethnicity, like music, dance, food, clothing, history, the flag.
Yeah.
And I was working in the Broward County School District, not for the school, but that's where I was doing my work, was in that school district.
Yeah.
And there's like 100 different cultures. I mean, it's a very diverse, place, Broward County, where Fort Lauderdale is. And so they would have this time during this weekend thing that we do with these high school kids where they'd be like, okay, divide up into your cultural group and then come up with a way you want to showcase your culture. And then the next day, everybody was going to put on a little show. And I did it probably a dozen times, but the first time I did it, I noticed I was looking around and there were some kids that were like not quick to rush off to the group that you just expected they rush off to, like, I know you're Caribbean, or you definitely look white to me, or some kind of Hispanic, but of course it broke. I mean, this is Florida. It wasn't Hispanic. It broke down into Venezuelan and Ecuadorian and Brazilian and Cuban and and there wasn't Caribbean. There was Trinidadian and Jamaican and but there were people, a few kids, like maybe somewhere between half a dozen kids every single time. They didn't go to those groups, and I would notice that they didn't go. So I would round them all up and I'd say, okay, what stopped you from going to your group? Well, I mean, I'm not into hip hop. I like heavy metal. Or, I was born here and my parents don't really celebrate our culture. Right. And whatever it was, well, I mean, my family's Irish, but I don't, they didn't know where to go, And so I'd say, okay, well, why don't you spend some time figuring out what you all have in common? Like, what's your cultural reference? And I started naming them countercultural kids. They were basic. That's what it was. They were countercultural. I'm countercultural. I've always been countercultural, even though, I mean, I went to punk rock parties dressed as a preppy. I even went to a punk rock party once in my Coast Guard uniform. I mean, if that's not countercultural, I don't know what is. Right? So, in a way that's not popular, right? Yeah. But I don't care. I don't care about popularity. I just don't care about that.
Yeah.
And so these kids were the cultural creatives. They were the countercultural kids. They were the black sheep. They were the nonconformists.
Yeah.
And I loved those kids, and so they would put on their cultural showcase. And it was always different.
Yeah.
Eclectic, of course, because they would celebrate nonconformity. They would talk about people in history and music styles and dance styles and food, like fusion. And they would showcase nonconformity or countercultural. And so, like, that's what it means, right? It's some people feel pressure to go with the group, and some people reject the group. I'm neither of those things. I just gravitate. Right. What some people say, something like I dance to my own tune, or I hear a different drum beat. Like, I think outside the box, whatever people say, like, I'm that person and I'm it naturally. I'll basically be easygoing. Everything will be fine. I don't have a qualm with anything. And then somebody throws in some kind of authoritarian, demand. Yeah. And immediately I go, all right, like, you're my community, but I do not like what you're doing. And I'm going to say so. And then I'm going to get out of here. Right.
Yeah.
So it's just something comes up in me and I say, no, this isn't my place. These aren't my people. But I've never felt isolated or alone. I don't withdraw. I was never part of cliques in high school. I had friends in a bunch of different cliques. And when I had parties at my house, everybody was invited. Well, except for the posers.
Of course.
Gen X, right? No posers allowed.
Yeah.
Right. So that, and I was an athlete, but I was also a skateboarder, but I didn't smoke pot with all the other skateboarders, and I definitely wasn't a jerk like a bunch of the jocks.
Yeah.
And I had a girlfriend who was a cheerleader, right? So that was kind of jockish, but like I was a girl, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like,
No,
so it was
it's sort of fascinating because it feels like I think probably more people connect to that energy than allow themselves to, right? Because we're so there's so much safety in being drawn to the poles. But whether you're talking about politics, I think there's a lot of energy where people are like, I want to be kind of able to hang out with the jocks and hang out with the preps and hang out with the skateboarders because I have a bit of that in me. But yet you're telling me I have to fit one way. And I think even when it relates to work, there's so much right now. You talked about the working from home or coming back to office. Everything is on the extreme of that kind of a thing. And even sort of there's two extremes of either we think about work through a very sort of therapy language kind of way, which is kind of a new way of talking about work, or it's got to be like hustle culture, grind, work until you bleed kind of a thing. And yet most of us fall in between. Like, yeah, I can use terms like psychological safety, but I don't have to sort of marinate in that language to move forward. But I also don't have any interest in grinding my way through the next X number of years of my life. And so the third space feels almost like it's an invitation to value the complexity and humanity that most of us want to actually feel and live, but we're drawn to the sides of it.
Well, the quickest way to psychological safety in the workplace is to tool up your employees to be able to regulate their own emotions and tolerate distress and mitigate conflict and manage stress and get their sleep in alignment so that they can better deal with, the things that just happen in life, right? I say to people, we can't eradicate conflict.
Yeah.
We cannot eliminate stressors from our life. We can't escape all the bullies, and we can't make everybody adjust to protect our comfort and safety.
Yeah.
Because if you're working in a workplace with 100 people, whose psychological safety are you prioritizing? You can't prioritize all of them. But one way to make sure that most of them feel psychologically safe is to give them the tools to develop their own sense of psychological safety rather than treating the workplace like romper room.
Yeah, or treating it like a series of boxes we have to retreat to in order to feel safe, because I don't feel safe when I'm exposed to somebody who thinks differently than me, looks differently, talks about work differently than me, et cetera, right? Yeah. Psychological safety is not sort of the absence of negativity. It is the being equipped to manage it however it comes at us, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, people have different opinions on that. That's my opinion.
Yeah. I tend to align. I mean, I think there are some fundamental needs that are probably worth trying to meet in any organization, but then it is I think imperative to give people tools to manage the inevitable stressors of working with people. We're complex, we're annoying sometimes, we're difficult sometimes we're awesome, sometimes that person who was awesome yesterday is a pain in the butt the next day. That's what reality is. So how do we prepare ourselves for that? To me, feels very much in line with what you're talking about.
Because that's just life. Right?
Yeah.
If we expect that we're going to go through the rest of our life with somebody else removing all of the obstacles in our way, like when we were children, right? We are adults now, and we shouldn't expect everybody else to move the obstacles in our way. We might need to figure out, is that actually an obstacle, right? And is it in my way? Like, is it an obstacle I can go around,
right?
That I can move? And I can ignore.
Yeah. There's a much bigger toolkit in front of us than I think we think. Yeah. Speaking of the the folks who are out in the world trying to deal with all this stuff, I always like to ask, do you have a question that I could pose to the audience and maybe try to generate some conversation based on some of the stuff we've been talking about today?
Well, perhaps perhaps the listener would like to know for themselves, like, what's their third space, right? What maybe they've already identified, their third spaces, and maybe they've acted on them, and maybe they haven't, or maybe they haven't even really thought about it. Like, in what ways do you just find yourself, sort of out of sync, so to speak, or just different from, the people from what they expect of you.
Yeah.
Right.
I love that.
And are you at peace with it? Right.
Yeah.
And you integrate it in as just part of who you are, but not because, right. I know people who go from like born again Christians to atheists. I'm like, well, not that.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's just a reaction.
Yeah.
Right. If you really think about it and you think things through, you might be like, yeah, I don't do religion anymore, but there's so many of them and they're really interesting and people find a lot of value in it. Right. So it's like not in that reactionary way.
Yeah.
But in a way, like, I just naturally gravitate towards wanting to do this or being near this or thinking this. And then know that there are a lot of people out in the world just like you. I have found so many trans people that are heterodox in their thinking, right? Meaning not orthodox, not held to orthodoxies, not beholden to authoritarianism. There's so many of us.
Yeah.
But we're not very visible. We're not on social media, but we know who we are, and we see each other and we communicate with each other in a lot of different ways. And so we know that, we exist.
Yeah. And how I don't know if comforting is the right word. It almost feels too soft of a word, but there is a sense of relief when you get to find others who are at least sharing something that resonates with you, that you maybe felt alone in for a while, and having a third space, whether that's a group chat or you go hang out once a month, or you come for a trip every year, or whatever, some kind of forum. Like, I think there's a lot of value in that, and I think encouraging people to seek that out, as opposed to retreating either to nihilism, there's no hope, there's nobody like me, blah blah blah, or like you said, this dramatic reactionary thing of, well, if I'm not that, I must be that. I love that.
Well, that part of our brain that says fight or flight or freeze or fawn, what is also hardwired into us is, we're tribal. We're hardwired to have a strong desire, impulse to belong.
Yeah.
And so for some people, that instinct to want to belong leads them to engage with people that are not healthy for them. Yeah. And so people think, oh, I can't be around it, and they run from it, and then they suffer the consequences of isolation and withdrawal, which are not good on our physical and mental health. So, one of the reasons I wanted to write my book is because I want to let people know, like, there are consequences for when you don't toe the line, and that's okay, as long as you know how to navigate that. And there's a whole lot of people in the world, and you're not alone. That was the main reason why I wanted to do it. I use my own personal life stories, and then I weave into it all of these psychoeducation tools and strategies.
I love that. I think that that's so needed right now. Coming back fully to the world of work, we've covered a lot here. If you could wave a magic wand and sort of fully desuckify the world of work, what does that world look like?
Desuckify. Oh boy. Well, I think I'd get rid of all those really terrible lights in the workplace.
God, yeah.
Right, those are terrible. And I'd want workplaces to be much more natural, like a lot of windows and views of really beautiful natural surroundings or beautiful architecture that is blending with nature.
Mm,
You know, garden terraces and window gardens, and like bringing
mm,
plants and trees, like lots of, I worked in a workplace once that like every once in a while they'd have somebody would bring a dog through. Like it's great. It
hmm.
was like pet therapy, it was
Yeah.
wonderful to pet the dog. Or somebody would come in and do hair massage, like just bringing like that kind of thing into the workplace just to recognize that like work can be stressful and it's demanding. And it's nice
Hmm.
to be able to look at nice things and maybe hear nice things, right? Like
Yeah.
nice, like not white noise, but more like green noise, right? The sounds of nature. Again, I
Yeah.
love nature, although that
Hmm.
wasn't exactly my example when I was giving earlier about the value, but I do really love nature. But
Mm,
it's so that for me, that would be it, like a more natural environment.
mm.
That I mean, maybe it'd be possible to go to 32-hour work week. That would be great too.
I think that that would be huge, and I love where you're going with the idea of creating spaces that are, whether it's kind of your sort of nature driven thing or just spaces that feel more inspired, more
Yes.
beautiful, more
Yeah.
connected, more conducive to human connection and all that stuff. I mean, you think about the back to work stuff, and in addition to the challenges with sort of going, got to come back to work, and some of the issues around that, at least from my perspective, there's the like workplaces just generally suck. Like they're cold, they have the bad
Yeah.
lighting, they're distraction factories where you can't
Yeah.
concentrate on your work. They make it very easy for you to just get lost in meeting after meeting after meeting, or conversation after conversation that's not really relevant to what you're trying to do right then. There's so many challenges to workspaces that if you created beautiful spaces, some people would be like, I want to go there. Like, yeah, I could work from home today, but that feels really cool if I could go to that place that has the beautiful view and the terrace and the
Absolutely.
greenery and nice sounds and different kinds of spaces so I can concentrate when I want to, collaborate when I want to. But I think there's a business idea in there. Maybe some
Well,
kind of,
think about like cubicles are gray and
yeah,
they're flat. And I'm like, wouldn't it be nice if cubicles were like maybe lower and they had like they kind of had curves to them and they were
curves
like
and
maybe
natural
orange and
forms.
yellow and
Yeah.
green and blue. You know what I mean? Like
Oh
the
gosh, yeah.
color. I've worked in too many places where it's like white walls, gray cubicle wall. Ugh,
Yeah. And then you throw
and then people have their doors
the
shut and it's
fluorescent
like,
light on top of it or the harsh
oh,
light
it's
on top of
awful.
it. And it's
Awful.
yeah, it's prison like. Um,
Yeah.
on a lighter note, one of the things I like to do is bring a little sound effects into my show. You'll hear it at the beginning and end of most episodes for me. I'm a cat guy, so you'll hear meows and hisses or whatever. Do you have a desuckified sound effect that you can add to the show?
Yes, I worked on it. So let's see how it works. So I'm gonna take a drink of water and then make a sound that people will recognize. So let's see if you can hear it.
I do like that sound. I mean, that the sort of sound after you drink, there is a sort of a release and a relaxation that comes with it. It also,
Refreshment, right?
yeah, like, and I think of that both sort of the literal feeling of it, but the sort of metaphorical of like you have a good experience and you're just like, that was good.
Yeah.
And it reminded me a
Yes.
little of the Larry David show. There was somebody was doing that and they were getting mad. They were like, "Why do you do that sound? Like, that's weird,"
Yeah.
which is typical for that show. Um,
Have you ever seen the movie What About Bob?
oh God, yeah, years ago, yeah,
So my one of my I love the whole thing, but one of my really favorite scenes is when he's eating dinner with the family and he keeps just going, like everybody takes, he's like, and the whole family is laughing except for the dad, of course, who's getting angrier and
yeah.
angrier. And I highly recommend that for comic relief. What about Bob? That's
Mm.
right up there.
Oh
Right
God,
up
it's such a
there.
good one. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, last question. You mentioned it briefly, I think, before, but just coming back to it, where is the best place for people to find you online?
I'm on LinkedIn, so it's probably It's Zander Keig, Keig.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a website. It's zanderkeig.net.
Okay.
And I'm also on Substack. I have 2 pages on Substack. One is the Umbrella Hour podcast.substack.com. That's one of my podcasts. And the other is the Third Space podcast.substack.com. So I have 2 podcasts. One I've been doing is my 3rd year of the Umbrella Hour, and I just started the Third Space podcast.
Oh,
I
very
only have
cool.
one guest interview episode up currently. I have another one in the can. It just hasn't gone up.
So. Awesome. That's exciting. I mean, I've checked out the Umbrella Hour, which is great. It digs into a lot of good stuff. But the new one, given all that you've just talked about with the Third Space, sounds awesome. So I look forward to checking that out and invite people to do it as well. And with that, I'll just say, Zander, thank you very much. We obviously went really long because I think we got into a lot of good stuff. It was a wonderful conversation. And just thank you for coming on and sharing your perspective on the world and work and all that good stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, TJ. And thank you for having this platform for people to be able to talk about these topics. And, desuckifying work is a good goal.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's a chore, but it's a fun one.
Absolutely.
All right. Bye-bye, Zander.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to the DesuckifyWork Podcast. And a huge thanks to Zander for bringing wit and wisdom to the show. You can follow Zander on LinkedIn and check out his site at zanderkeig.net. That's Keig, where you'll find all kinds of cool content, including his 2 podcasts, The Umbrella Hour and The Third Space. If you enjoyed the conversation and would like to dive deep into some of your own challenges at work, I invite you to schedule a free half-hour discovery session where we can explore new, desuckified possibilities for your future. Bye, everyone.